Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also a Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council, doing something a little bit different today. Nick, it's you and me trying to figure out where we are in the world, what American citizens want from the world, what are we doing in the world? So we want you all to give us feedback. Please join us at our Twitter handle at Doorstep Podcast. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. We are almost out of the second quarter. So much has been happening. I feel like we've lived 5 years in the last 4. So we want to take a pause and try to see what you all are thinking, our audience is thinking, and just reflect a little bit about what's going on in the world, and talk to you about a great event that we have next week here at the Doorstep and ask you to join us. We have our next book talk with Amy Webb, author of The Genesis Machine, also founder of the Future Today Institute. Amy thinks big picture, where are we going to be in 50 years? So never mind tomorrow. I don't know where I'm even going to be tomorrow, but in 50, 100 years, where is technology taking us? It's going to be a great book talk, and please join us. Go to carnegiecouncil.org to sign up, and that's next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. So thank you all. And Nick, let's start out with, and I want all of our audience to know, the pandemic is still here. I know it's not on top of headlines, but I'm just recovering from COVID, and I cannot believe it because I already had it. I'm vaxxed and boosted. And I think we're not talking enough about the challenge that the pandemic is going to continue to bring not only the US, but the rest of the world. Yesterday, no more masks on airplanes. What are you going to do? Are you worried? Are you scared? What are you hearing on your end of the world?
Well, I think first, to put this into perspective, it speaks to a problem in how we process news and information, that we can only process seemingly one big story at a time. And for that time, it was COVID, and then COVID dropped off because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That dominated headlines. Now, the invasion is sort of settling into things. The pandemic comes back as people suddenly start paying attention to it again, and then they'll be looking at something else. We're seeing a lot of change and disruption, prices, inflation, supply chain, bottlenecks, concerns about commodities, climate. A year ago this time, we were talking a lot about climate and the UN summit, and that the pandemic featured into that because we were looking at the pandemic as part of an environmental issue. So first, just before getting to the point about COVID, it is this sense, as you said, that we've been living through it's seemingly 5 years worth of news in 4 months. But it also speaks to a question of, can we process the fact that multiple things can be happening that are important and critical at the same time, and that events don't happen neatly, sequentially, where we can say this is over. The question with the pandemic now, and both with the mask mandates on transportation being struck down as by a federal judge as an overextension of the authority of the Centers for Disease Control, marking or sitting alongside these very dramatic images we get out of places like Shanghai and other cities in China that have gone back into massive amounts of lockdown, where we've seen people confined to apartments. We've seen the footage of drones flying through the city telling people to stay inside. We've seen food riots. We've seen these almost dystopian conditions at these COVID isolation centers, and particularly even in some of the journalists that have been confined there that have been able to get those images out. And that does suggest that we don't quite have a handle on the pandemic. And is the question that Americans in particular are just more willing to roll the dice now and say, we're going to accept a higher level of risk? What happens in a few weeks if cases spike and this has an impact on the transportation industry? Not that people do or don't want to wear masks on flights, but simply that flights are being canceled because crews aren't available because people have gotten sick or people have tested positive and therefore aren't cleared to fly. Um, at this point, I think we're also again looking at how does this factor into vaccine mandates? How does this factor into requirements of being able to access public spaces, vaccines, tests, and other things? All of those issues that kind of disappeared from coverage for a few months I think are all going to come back. And again, against the backdrop of trying to avoid an escalation in Ukraine that could turn very ugly for the world, trying to deal with the fact that people in other parts of the world are already seeing the invasion hit their doorstep pocketbooks with higher prices for food and fuel and things like that. And you put all of this together, and does it lead to a more combustible late spring, early summer for us as we move forward?
Yeah, you mentioned the gas prices. I want to riff on that because I was looking at the Fox News webpage, and they have a map of the United States, and with all the prices in different states on a sliding scale, which I thought was fascinating to have that on your front page when there's so much news going on. However, that speaks to the point that we are in a midterm year. We've mentioned this on our previous podcasts, and I was looking at, I know poll numbers, but I was looking at Biden's poll numbers, and they are atrocious when you compare them to all of the, past few presidencies. It's amazing how low he's polling. And I do think that maybe these issues, as you said, aren't top of the headlines. And maybe this is a news problem and a reporting problem that we can talk about separately. But it's definitely being spoken about at the doorstep. And people are taking all of these mask mandates, vaccine mandates, inflation pressures into consideration when they're looking at leadership and how the U.S. is doing at home and abroad. And I want to ask you, what is your sense of what Biden is up against as the representative of the Democratic Party in the midterms? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? It's April. I mean, we have campaigns in full swing here.
Look, it's going to be a real challenge. It's always a challenge for the president to have his party retain control if they control both houses of Congress in a midterm election. But you have these pressures building up, and partly because, again, you go back to our podcasts that we did with Tom Nichols, with Judah Grunstein, right at the beginning of the Biden administration, when we were looking at this question of the turn, the end of the Trump administration, the beginning of the Biden administration, and you look at the sense that Biden was supposed to, or at least ran on a platform of restoring a degree of normality, restoring kind of the American system, the way it operates. We had all of this talk about foreign policy for the middle class. We were going to have this new focus on climate. When we had our podcast with Carolyn Kassan talking about climate statecraft and the first steps there. The Biden administration came in with the sense that they were going to try to move forward on a number of issues, and really they've moved into reactive mode as kind of events have overtaken them. And they're now being, I think, assessed on, their ability to deliver. But again, we're back to media perceptions, which is that the extent to which the media, not just the broadcast media and the print media, but social media, create or set expectations about what, how to interpret the reality around you. And the tone has really moved dystopian. It has moved that things are terrible, that we have all of these crises, the pandemic, the fact that the Biden administration was blamed in 2021 for not getting a handle on the pandemic. Partly they were hoisted on some of their own campaign rhetoric's petard, that they were going to do a much better job, and the pandemic had other ideas, particularly the Omicron variant, as to how it was going to be handled. The inability to you could put this coalition, this kind of anti-Trump coalition together, but to then become a governing coalition is much more difficult. And we saw how much of the Biden administration's proposals did not have a unified coalition in Congress to move to pass them into legislation quickly. That's contributed, I think, to this sense that the world is coming apart. We had our very dramatic podcast last year with the Afghan journalists, literally as Kabul was falling to the Taliban, and that, of course, as much as there was a strategic and a doorstep logic behind getting the U.S. out of Afghanistan, the imagery of how that happened, I think, has contributed as well to a sense that the Biden administration is faltering or is having issues. And as you said, also the campaigns, not just simply the campaigns have started in April, the campaigns are perpetual now.
Right.
And really, some of the issues, and then this gets at some of the things, we had several of our guests last year, and I'm thinking particularly of when we had Aubrey Cox-Ottenstein talking about generational issues. That's playing out in this as well. That the president and the generation that he's from, we're seeing this with Speaker Pelosi, with Senator Feinstein, others really raising the question of the baby boom generation, not necessarily the leadership that is agile and nimble enough for moving into the 21st century. And Tatiana, you commented on this a few weeks ago. When you look at kind of the contrast of European leadership, particularly these very dynamic prime ministers, women prime ministers in Finland and Sweden and Estonia, and other leaders, President Zelensky himself, 44, 45 years old. We're looking at that, tail end of Generation X or first wave millennials coming in, and that it conveys a very different image. And I think that's playing out at least subconsciously as well when we consider the fact that the U.S., not just simply we're looking at the midterms, but we're looking at the presidential race in the U.S. in 2024 may very well be two baby boom candidates slugging it out for the White House. And that, I think, subtly sends a different message, again, in comparison with what we've seen in Europe. Even again, as we talked in our last broadcast about the French elections, and even there that we're looking at, younger candidates, obviously representing very different perspectives on democracy and France's role in Europe and transatlantic relations. But, it creates a dynamism that's there that I think we are going to be running into some issues with our politics here.
You mentioning all those names just had me thinking: U.S., China, Russia, all really old leaders, versus a lot of these smaller countries, New Zealand too. I mean, we're also in other parts of the world, and Latin America, also much younger leadership coming to the fore, which I think people aspire to and want to see. I think in a huge part, so I'm writing this piece on social media and the war in Ukraine, in a huge part, it is the image of a young President Zelensky that is driving the social media coverage. I mean, if he was 100 years old, like some leaders, I don't think he would be getting the same amount of, kudos. I mean, it's the vigor, not only physically and, because it is physical presence. I mean, it just is, but also the ability then to understand social media and understand new forms of expression and be able to zoom in around the world and be able to engage with crypto and be able to engage with TikTok. I mean, these new ways of communication and Twitch. I mean, gamers are all over the Ukraine war. Who would have ever predicted that a year ago? I mean, I think that we need to understand and move and maybe think about whether the US might be too big, or too entrenched in ways, our systems are too entrenched in ways like Russia and China that we aren't really nimble. I don't know. Do you think I'm taking the analogy too far?
No, I mean it's a concern that some of my colleagues and I have had. This was something that Derek Reveron and Mac Owens and I touched on in our a book we did a few years ago on America as an incidental superpower. In our last chapter, one of the things that we hit on is kind of the ossification of the certainly of the U.S. national security apparatus, not nimble, not responsive, but you could say our politics as well, or at least at the state and local levels, we see people using these new tools much more effectively. But yes, at the national level, uh, because they don't follow the long established bureaucratic scripts, they're unpredictable. They can careen off in unexpected directions, and I think that there's a suspicion. And again, as you said, the comparisons, as we've seen over the last 60, 70 days between, an autocratic, aging, isolated President Putin, with everyone at the other end of the table, and it's all very structured. And we've seen with the President Zelensky, very open, engaged, taking people, through using social media to really give everyone, when he, a number of weeks back when he's on the streets of Kiev with his cabinet, and all very informal, but saying, here, we're in the fight and we're not giving up, and what that has done for boosting morale and boosting assistance. Now, I mean, obviously, I think Ukraine isn't happy with the level of assistance that it's gotten, but one really has to credit the messaging, particularly by President Zelensky, in shifting attitudes. When you look at the first days of the invasion, the predominant attitude in many places in Europe, even in some segments of the United States, was this is going to be a very quick conflict. Ukraine needs to settle. Ukraine needs to offer a bunch of concessions. We can't get involved. And partly this has changed that narrative, where you now have, the latest reports of, the United States is committing not a few pieces of equipment here and there, but some really major defense deliveries to Ukraine designed to change the balance on the battlefield. So, an older president in Ukraine might have taken that advice, well-meaning as it was from the Biden administration, which I think in retrospect would have been fatal, of people advising President Zelensky to leave Kiev in the first days and to either go to Lviv or to prepare a government in exile or something like that. I think that would have been disastrous. But I think you see with this, again, this use of these social media strategies. But then let's bring it back to the doorstep, in that what does this mean then, as again we look at our own politics, for what type of politician, what type of campaigner, how do you reach voters, how do you create and craft messages, and if the last 30 years we were dominated by the James Carville, David Axelrod, Lee Atwater types of how you shape candidates, and it's image control and everything of that, and very structured. And then, of course, as we saw in the 2016 Clinton campaign, hyper polling and really trying to message. Are we moving to where we're going to look for candidates and political figures that have this openness and authenticity about them, and that moves us away from the data-driven and highly scripted and poll-tested imaging? So, I mean, that's, I think, remains to be seen how that's going to play out here, but definitely, I think President Zelensky, and the extent to which, I think, again, we talked about this on an earlier podcast, the extent to which other leaders around the world are trying to emulate him, down to Macron, adopting a similar casual
He should not
olive
wear a
t-shirt.
t-shirt.
No, he
No,
can't wear a t-shirt
no.
the same way. No, but that speaks to, again, the impact that he's had.
Well, yeah, and I think that is huge and going to be a game changer. And I have to tell you, and I'll bring it to the doorstep too, in terms of messaging and use of social media. Um, I do think the younger generations not only use social media just to use it, but we've seen, for example, in Ukraine, a lot of, and Russia, influencers, who have huge followings on Instagram or TikTok, pivot from, telling how to wear makeup and dress to raising funds, to showing what's going on in their towns and cities. So I do think that there is an increasing political activism. And I mentioned this for a couple of years now, but I do think that where this might be, for me, a tipping point. And the tipping point is that Amazon union first union out of here, out of New York, based solely on efforts of young generation, including a student from my college, Marymount Manhattan College, who very quickly and swiftly turned it around and has inspired, by the way, on the ground, students of mine to say, hey, I'm at Starbucks, let me start a union. I mean,
Yeah.
It has gotten this talk. We just avoided a doorman's union here in New York City, and they got what they wanted. They got a pay increase, right? I mean, I am wondering if we're not only seeing a tipping point where youth are even going to be more active in this political midterm season because of what they're seeing on the ground around the world, and they, being interconnected like never before. And I stand by my thesis, even if with all this polarization, I stand by my thesis. But also this idea that you can not only advocate and message, but you actually can make change with this unionizations actually being voted for. So, it's moving just from talk to actual implementation. And I think that is a huge difference when people see that their actions can actually resonate and happen, and not just be talked about or in a nice Twitter image. I think that is making a huge difference and maybe a huge pivot point in the midterms.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to points that Tia Tyree raised with us last year, and then Joseph Marks earlier this year, about the new tools, for mobilizing, organizing, connecting. As always, people had, and this was, I think, our cautionary note from Tom Nichols, that you have to make the jump from the virtual to the real world space and what you do. But we're seeing how that's playing out. But again, the question of how people are going to, what will mobilize them, what they see. Is it going to be the environment, the economy, what's happening in places like Ukraine, their own sense of, that the system isn't giving them the fair shake that they deserve, and therefore they're organizing and finding ways to get around the traditional blocks that prevented people from being able to connect to each other, primarily the geographic block, that you actually had to be reasonably proximate. Again, we're seeing with some of these organizing efforts that people are dispersed, and that they are able to connect through these tools without having to have either geographic proximity, but also increasingly having to go through state-controlled or government-controlled nodes that you can reach people directly. Again, one of the things I'm going back to, to the war in Ukraine, is the amount of information that we are getting as regular citizens that is not mediated through governments. Where all of this, this whole rise of of this whole OSINT, open source intelligence community of experts that are able to take all of these social media postings and get us a real picture of what's happening in a way that, in a way, it's like another, again, we ended one cycle that started in '91 with the Gulf War, where CNN, jumped ahead of traditional broadcast networks to show what a satellite 24-hour satellite cable network could do in terms of broadcasting. And then you're right, TikTok and Twitter and Twitch and all of these other platforms are showing, the next wave of information retrieval, in this case from the war in Ukraine, where you're pulling things directly from people's social media feeds. People are going out and recording, and then in some cases inadvertently social media and technology leakage, because so many people, with their phones, geolocation, their Fitbits, and the like, and suddenly you're able to put a much different picture together.
And, not always accurate. So fact checking is important. I have to say that as a journalist, we have to always fact check information. Don't take anything you see on social media at face value. But I do think as a tool, you're absolutely right. And the other T is Telegram. That's how I get all of my information about what is going on. But it's not just the social media connection. And so once again, I'm going to give you how it's also happening, that it's jumped to action. So I have people in my own sphere who not only fundraised and bought stuff here in the US, but have literally taken suitcases and carried them over to borders in Poland and crossed over and delivered them. It is an on the ground effort from the US, direct doorstep US efforts.
Yes.
Flying over, direct doorstep there to, again, border crossings in Poland and also Lviv. Now, with Lviv being attacked very close to the west, that is the westernmost city that has been attacked, for those of you in our audience who might not know the geography of Ukraine. But it's also this action that has been inspired, and I've never seen anything like it in my research. There's little bits and pieces that have happened, but on this mobilization, and I'm not going to call it mass mobilization, but it's almost, if you look at the numbers of people, the numbers in the Ukrainian diaspora who are doing this stuff,
yes,
you can call it mass mobilization within the diaspora, is incredible. So, I think this is going to be, and we'll keep looking at it here at the doorstep, social media turning into on the ground activism. What we wanted to see last year is actually happening. So this Ukraine war has not only transformed the way war is conducted, the digital warfare, information warfare, but also I think how societies are going to respond to crises. It's going to challenge organizations, I think, like the United Nations, and Zelensky put a direct challenge to existence. And it's going to mobilize, I think, the youth, which I believe have already been mobilized, my thesis, and into even more mobilization for the midterms. So that's kind of what I think. I don't know, Nick, do you have any other comments before I remind people to sign up for our book talk?
Well, I think that we're going to see, as we move forward in the next number of months, what I'm looking at is kind of doorstep perceptions of what is important and the set of issues that people are going to begin to prioritize. We've had some assumptions about those priorities, that gas prices, food prices, inflation will rise to the fore, but it's not clear yet what people are going to say. Well, what matters most to me at the doorstep, and that will feed into the campaign season here in the United States for the midterms, because I think both parties are gearing up for elections in which they think that there are a set of doorstep issues that will get them across the finish line, but they seem to be concluding that what those doorstep issues are going to be quite different, whether it's the economy, education, foreign policy, so on and so forth. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that gets shaped over the next number of months.
Yes, we will keep talking about these issues. Please continue to follow us on our Twitter handle at the Doorstep Podcast. Also, reminder again, a great talk, The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology. We'll be speaking with author Amy Webb next week, next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. Please, carnegiecouncil.org for signups. Thank you, Nick, for today. And we welcome again our audience. Please send us your questions. Where do you think we are in the world, and what are your doorstep issues for the midterm 2022?
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.